And ultimately, Zarqawi feels he needs friends, so he makes an alliance with bin Laden, makes up with him, and declares that he's the leader of Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, the Qaeda between the two rivers. They did a bombing in Jordan in 2005 of tourist hotels. There was a great Syrian director, Mustafa Akkad, who among his works were the Friday the 13th horror films. And Zarqawi blew him up. I thought it was ironic. That was the real terror. They practiced takfir, which is a kind of vigilante excommunication. They would just declare that other Muslims are not Muslims. This is frowned upon in Sunni Islam, but they do it. And also, if they didn't like the other Sunnis, imagine what they thought about Shiites, who they thought were wretched heretics. And they targeted Shiites. They would blow up a Shiite wedding, which is really mean. But you know, in Islamists like Orthodox Judaism, you would have the funeral the same evening. And they knew there would be a funeral. They would come back and blow up the funeral. So it's, I don't know what you even call that. And they would blow up ice cream shops where Shiite children were getting snacks. They blew up a pet shop. You know, the snakes were kind of writhing in the street and the rabbits were dead. The Americans couldn't understand what in the world were these people doing, because it seemed like there was random soft target, what the American military called soft targets. But it was clear to me what they were doing. They were mobilizing people, because the message to the Shiites is, we're coming for you, we're going to kill you. And they hoped that the Shiites' response would be, oh yeah, well, we'll kill you first. Then the Shiites would start attacking Sunnis, and the Sunnis would feel helpless, and who would volunteer to protect them? Zarqawi. So it's perfect. He was killed in 2006. And I think a lot of American military people thought that Zarqawi's death would end the insurrection. But in fact, other people just took over for him. It wasn't him, you know. There was a whole set of cells, and they were only one, and they were probably only about a third of the Sunnis were on the religious side of politics anyway at that point. So they continued blowing things up. Under the Americans, originally the Bush administration was going to install a Karzai kind of figure over Iraq. They would massage the government into existence. They would pretend the Iraqis had chosen it. And they would just declare somebody, you know, friend of George to be president. Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, who's the leading Shiite authority in Najaf, issued fatwas against them and said, no, you can't do it that way. Sistani is a very interesting man. He called for, after the invasion, he called for some books on American political science and read through them. So his fatwa to the Americans was that your idea of kind of caucus-based elections is what the Bushis called it, isn't going to work for Iraq. He said it won't produce a legitimate government. And then he said in Arabic, he said, Al-Hukuma Shari'iyya Munbathika min iradat al-Shab al-Iraqi. The legitimate government has to spring from the will of the Iraqi people. He quoted the popular sovereignty from Montesquieu, took the spirit of the laws and slapped Mr. Bremer with it. So the Americans were for, and then they had huge demonstrations demanding one person, one vote elections, which of course they knew the Shiites would win because they were majority. But the Bushis were kind of maneuvered into this. Well, but it was what happened. The religious Shiite parties, the fundamentalist parties, the ones who wanted a Shiite Islamic state and had been working for that for decades, they were the ones who won the 2005 elections. And I remember I tried to tell people this in this country, that they were, you're young enough, most of the people in this audience, you might not remember this, but this was, the Iraqi elections in 2005 were an American project. It was like, it was vindication of the whole invasion and occupation. So people would send me nasty emails that, you see, we had the elections, and there was a big turnout. I would say, but the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which was founded by Ayatollah Khomeini, won the elections. Why does that make the red states happy? I don't understand. And this one journalist called me, they said, now that the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq has won the elections, what do you think they will want? I said, well, let's start with their name. And then they made a constitution, which the Sunnis didn't like. Originally, they were going to put Ayatollahs in the constitution, and the Americans made them take that back out. In any case, the Sunni provinces voted against the constitution in late 2005. And right from there, you know that's not a good sign. You know, when a third of the country rejects the constitution, that's a civil war waiting to happen. And the Sunnis were oppressed by these Shiite fundamentalists. They viewed them as a security problem, and some of them were, but they overdid it. They took it out on the whole community. So if a bomb went off in a Sunni Arab city, you know, targeting a Shiite garrison, because most of the army ended up being Shiite, then they would just arrest all the Sunni youth in the area. Well, it's a Sunni city. There would be a lot of Sunni youth in the area. That's not a reason to arrest somebody. Maybe some of them got shrapnel, but that's how they had, the Americans and the Shiite government together by 2008 had 50,000 people in detention centers, and 2/3 of them were Sunni Arabs, and most of them were arbitrarily arrested. They were left there for years with no trial, no evidence against them. Some of them were tortured, and then some of the villages went into rebellion, and the government of Nouri al-Maliki, the Shiite prime minister, started sending helicopter gunships against them and shelling them, tanks against them. A lot of Sunni villages, we haven't been following this the last few years. That's their daily lives, is that their government was attacking them. And then there were all these young men in prison, and when the Arab Spring came along in 2011, the Sunnis, there was a kind of Sunni Arab Spring in Iraq, and they came out and they demonstrated, and they wanted democracy, and they wanted a voice, and the government sent helicopter gunships to shoot at them. Then the Syrian protests were treated similarly by the Syrian government, many of the Sunni Arab radicals in Iraq and the volunteers from the rest of the Arab world that come to support them thought there's more likely that they'll make headway in Syria, so they ran off to fight in Aleppo and Idlib and places like that. And this Zarqawi's organization, which had been Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, restyled itself the Islamic State of Iraq, and then they started calling themselves Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And the rest of the rebels really minded their tactics, because what they did is they would avoid fighting Bashar al-Assad, the Ba'ath government in Syria, and they would fight with the other rebels. So rebels would take on the Ba'ath, would get them out of a town or an army base, and establish, you know, a rebel local government, and then ISIL would come in and poach on them. They didn't play well with other children. And then they wouldn't bother to fight the Ba'ath army. They'd let the others do that. So they were an Al-Qaeda affiliate, remember, Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. Ayman al-Zawahiri, the successor to bin Laden, who's a mass murderer, has 3,000 people's lives on his hands, kicked ISIL out of Al-Qaeda. Said, you guys are too nasty to be in our organization. I mean, when Al-Qaeda won't have you. And then they started pioneering in capturing military bases from the Syrian Ba'ath, and they got the tanks, and they got the medium weaponry, and then, I'm sorry about that. It's a joke. My undergraduates insisted. In June of this year, the ISIL had made secretly behind the scenes an alliance with the the ex-Ba'athi officers and the Sufi orders in Mosul who had fought the Americans, and they said, look, we can rescue you from the Shiite government, which is oppressing you, and then we'll jointly rule. And I don't know, people in Mosul hadn't been paying attention to what happened in Syria because these guys don't jointly rule. So they provoked a set of urban uprisings. And the way the American narrative of this is given is that the 5,000 or 10,000 ISIL fighters came down from Syria into northern Iraq and conquered Mosul away from the Iraqi army, which largely ran away from them. That's not what happened. It's true, I mean, the ISIL fighters came over to Mosul, but they had made these political alliances with these revolutionary cells, which went back to the days of the American occupation. And there was, it was like Tahrir Square in Cairo in 2011. Mosul rose up against what they coded as the Shiite occupation army. And they threw stones at the soldiers, and even if you have like 70,000 troops in Mosul from the central government, if 2 million people are angry at you, that's not really very many. And so a lot of the young soldiers from Basra and Hilla and so forth from the south, they were afraid, they ran away. And then we now know that a lot of them weren't actually there. Probably about half of them had been allowed to buy out their service. So they were supposedly stationed in Mosul, but if they gave money to their officers, they didn't have to go up there. And then the officers who were in it to make money certainly weren't going to make Custer stand in Mosul, so they disappeared. And then the enlisted men looked around, the ones who hadn't bought out their service, and there's no officers around, and half of their guys had never shown up, and they said, well, I'm damned if I'm dying out up here at the hands of angry Sunnis. So ISIL did take over. And then it took over other cities to create, it had already taken in January Fallujah. But again, these are political takings. There's a military, or a guerrilla military element to them, but they're primarily political. And then they betrayed their new allies. So the Ba'athis and all those guys that made a deal with them, the armored convoys would come in the middle of the night and start taking them away. So the Ba'ath officers have been executed by their former allies, the ISIL. The tribal leaders have been executed, and so forth. And so I think that the ex-Baathists thought we can handle these guys. They're a bunch of rural fundamentalists, and once we get rid of the government in Mosul, then we'll take over and we'll kind of subordinate them. But it's happening all the other way around. Then the leader of the Islamic State in Iraq and Levant, as they had styled themselves, was an Iraqi, Ibrahim Samarai, who styled himself Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. But he was just like, he had a PhD in Islamic Studies from Baghdad University and from the 90s. I don't think Saddam Hussein probably put a lot of money in that department, so I wouldn't expect its standards to be that high. But he took it into his head to declare himself a caliph. The caliph was a kind of medieval Sunni institution, analogous to the papacy in Roman Catholicism, but with both a temporal and a political role initially. Ultimately, the political role was taken away by kings. In any case, I mean, this was a big deal in the press and so forth, but nobody takes this seriously, or almost nobody in the Sunni Arab world. I mean, it's not like people in Cairo think that Ibrahim Samarai is a caliph. I told one journalist, it's like, if you had a Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan who declared himself the Holy Roman Emperor. He probably could get some people to believe it. But that's the kind of thing that's going on. And if they didn't have their coercion and their tanks that they captured and so forth, people would just kill them. But then they did do very well on the battlefield, and they started moving towards the Kurdish areas to Erbil. And they have murder on their minds, we know this. I think the Obama administration really didn't want anything to do with Iraq. They got out of it. Barack Obama is from Hawaii. And he looks out on the world and he sees you know, Samsung in South Korea and Sony in Tokyo and trade deals to be had in the Philippines and there's, you know, like $2 trillion worth of trade a year to be had over there. And he looks at the Middle East and it's just trouble. Every time you get involved in it, and people slap you, you bring the Prime Minister to the Oval Office and you have a press conference and he insults you in front of the journalists, or you get involved with them and then they blow up your troops, or, you know, why would you do that when there's the Pacific Rim is much more fruitful? So Obama didn't want to have anything to do with Iraq, but he couldn't let Erbil fall to ISIL. That would, you know, be a massacre, and it would, I mean, for humanitarian reasons as well as political ones, it's impossible. So then he started bombing the ISIL positions and pushed them back from Kurdistan for now, and also from the Mosul dam. You know, dams are potential weapons of mass destruction, and you really don't want a terrorist organization to be in control of a dam. So Obama, I think, without really wanting to, got back involved in all this. And so that's my story about it. I'm sticking to it. And I think I'll stop there and take the questions.
I'm sorry, I've been dealing with fire hazard people. So don't move yet. We're still okay, but they will have to clear this up for, in a little while. But in the meantime, thank you so much for a wonderful and informative talk. What we're going to do is set up questions, set up a microphone for questions. If you have a question, please line up down here. And in the meantime, while you're doing that, I'd like to say thank you again to the History Association, who's been a tremendous amount of help and generous with their time. And I neglected to mention also my colleague in the Department of History and Research Studies, Dr. Ali, who's been very helpful for organizing this talk. So, ready to take questions?
First of all, I want to thank the department for sponsoring this. We can't think of anything behind the other issue would have been Ebola, but I haven't heard enough about that. I just want to ask Dr. Cole, recently the Turkish bombed positions of the PKK. What is the reluctance of the Turkish to side with shoot with white? What's behind that reluctance?
Okay, so you remember I said Iraq is a multicultural state, but those are very common in the Middle East, and Turkey is as well. So a substantial proportion of the Turkish population is actually Kurdish in the east and southeast. And Turkish nationalism of the early 20th century was very hardline nationalism, and so they didn't like the idea that there was anybody but Turks in Turkey, and they insisted that Kurdish was actually a form of Turkish. This is the linguistic version of climate change denial, and Kurdish is very clearly an Indo-European language. But, and so they wouldn't allow Kurdish to be on television or to be used in schools, and they insisted on trying to Turkify the Kurds, and if the Kurds gave them any trouble, they sent in the military. In the 1970s, 80s, 90s, there was a dirty war in eastern Turkey between the secular Kemalist Turkish nationalist army and Kurdish guerrillas. Some of them, like the PKK, which is the Kurdistan Workers' Party, were actually Marxists. So it's a little bit like, you know, the Zapatistas in New Mexico. But there was this separatism idea amongst the guerrillas. And that wasn't, you know, a big movement, because most Kurds in Turkey, if you ask them in the opinion polls, are very happy to be, you know, Turkish citizens. They wish they could be Kurdish Turkish citizens and not have to suppress their ethnic identity. But The Turkish army won the war against the Kurdistan Workers' Party guerrillas by the late 90s. But then when the Americans invaded and occupied Iraq, the guerrillas